I am a son of Asimbala Sagdiev and Boltok the rapist. My hobbies is play ping pong. Let's go down, let's go down, let's go down, let's go down, let's go down.
The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate for monetary policy. Maximum employment, which means economic growth, job creation, that's one part of the dual mandate. The other part, price stability, means low inflation, keeping the value of the currency more or less stable. Those both very important.
The extraction of equity from homes has been a significant support to consumer spending. Were it not for this phenomenon, economic activity would have been notably weaker. I've always believed we underestimate the impact of stock prices on economic activity. I don't know where the stock market is going, but I will say this, that if it continues higher, this will do more to stimulate the economy than anything we've been talking about today or anything anybody else is talking about.
The Fed has powerful tools to influence the economy and the financial system. While we have made progress, we have farther to go. The mandate of the Federal Reserve is to serve all the American people. And too many Americans still can't find a job and worry how they'll pay their bills and provide for their families. The purpose of quantitative easing, we've been buying longer-term Treasury securities and agency mortgage-backed securities. The objective has been to push down longer-term interest rates, and I believe we've succeeded in doing that, and to more broadly make financial conditions accommodative. The purpose is to spur spending in the economy and to achieve more rapid economic growth.
She wears underwear with dick holes in them.
Negative interest rates policy doesn't mean we're at a limit of our easing policy. This adds another option from interest rate side to the current quantitative and qualitative easing policy. Reduction in real interest rates will stimulate investment and spending.
Do you do me?
Oh, you couldn't handle it, little man.
Hey! The Fed's lowered from 5.25% to essentially 0 over the last 2 years. Unemployment rate's gone from 4.5% to 9%. So it's clear we can't control unemployment rates with any precision whatsoever.
Which means it should never be given a mandate to worry about the economy, to worry about employment. Because if it has to do that, it will manipulate asset prices, which is what it does.
It is no longer just outsiders who criticize Bernanke's efforts to play the hero for financial markets.
I don't know what the equilibrium rate of interest is exactly, but I'm very confident that it's not 0.
We kept rates too low for too long. That's history. Confronted with a situation where the heart stopped pumping, we had to be the pacemaker and make it work again.
Hey, you boys better hold on, because I'm going to have to stand on it.
Everybody wants to go back and say, things are fine now. Look, we solved our problem. We're just asking for another crisis.
This is an experiment. We've never done this before. We've never been here before. The Federal Reserve is really operating by the seat of their pants.
The Fed's balance sheet, the value of its assets, ballooned from around $900 billion in 2008 to $4.5 trillion in 2015. After its first QE announcement in November 2008, the Fed launched 2 more rounds.
After they did the dot-com bubble, and that burst, and they reinflated it with the real estate and credit crisis bubble, and then when that burst, now they've created the bubble of all bubbles. And it's not only the United States, this is a global bubble. They're all into it. It's called the bailout bubble. Hey, the economy's going down, recession's setting in, sales don't look good, exports soft, need more money? How about we'll call it stimulus packages? And from Australia to the United States, from the UK to China, they're dumping funny money into the system to keep it going.
Sirs, another insurance company is going under. Now determining most prudent move for insurance company. Bailout. The most prudent move is a bailout. Bail out the insurance company.
Moreover, the economic expansion is increasingly broad-based across sectors as well as across much of the global economy. I expect that with gradual adjustments in the stance of monetary policy, the economy will continue to expand and the job market will strengthen somewhat further, supporting faster growth in wages and incomes. Although asset valuations are high by historical standards, overall vulnerabilities in the financial sector appear moderate, as the banking system is well capitalized and broad measures of leverage and credit growth remain contained.
The Federal Reserve partly caused the crisis by setting interest rates too low, encouraging everyone to borrow too much and generally do silly things. But the argument of Hayek and his followers actually runs deeper than that. It's not just that they got their sums wrong and they didn't set the right interest rate. It's that they shouldn't have been in the business of setting interest rates at all. It's this radical rejection of the state's role in regulating the market that sets Hayek apart from other free market thinkers. He believed the market would do a far better job regulating itself if only governments would just leave it alone.
Free market did not set interest rates at 1% under Greenspan. That's the government that is doing that. That is price fixing. It's kind of the way the old Soviet Union used to fix the price of bread or gasoline. The U.S. government fixes interest rates the same way. We need the market to set interest rates, not the government. And if the market set interest rates, they would have been much higher. And we wouldn't have had these problems.
Enter the Fed, America's central bank. In late 2008, it cut interest rates to virtually zero. That's where they've been ever since. Growth has been so anemic that the Fed has left interest rates where they are, in the hopes of giving the economy a helping hand. Now, things have gotten better. Unemployment is down, housing prices have rebounded, as has the stock market. People have more money, and on the whole, they're feeling pretty good. Higher interest rates from the Fed reflect the fact that the economy is largely back. And if you're worried about higher interest rates, it's still going to be really cheap to borrow. Mortgage rates will stay low, same goes for car loans and credit cards. So be happy. The U.S. is ready to move past crisis-era policies aimed at supporting the economy at all costs. That's a good thing.
In the 1920s, the governor of the New York Federal Reserve had a revolutionary idea. Benjamin Strong thought he could use the bank's power to set interest rates to influence what was happening in the economy. In many ways, that idea of using interest rates marked the start of modern monetary policy. Strong began buying government debt on the open market, which did have the effect of raising the amount of money in the economy. But unlike Austria's hapless central bankers, Strong had a strategy. The difference with Austria was that the Fed wasn't buying treasury bonds to help the government pay its bills, it was doing it to get money into the market and keep interest rates low. The central bank wanted to encourage everyone, individuals and households, to borrow more from the banks. It worked. What happened next in America led Hayek to conclude there can be something worse than government ignorance: hubris. He thought that entire period showed the calamity that can come when governments try to use the power of money to shape the economy. In America in the 1920s, the greatest boom the world had ever seen was taking off. Consumers couldn't get enough of new products like cars, telephones and record players. The stock market rose higher and higher. As the roaring 20s wore on, the finest economic minds in America came to believe the boom would never end. With loans so cheap, many borrowed money to buy shares. Others invested heavily in property. The Federal Reserve hoped its intervention would keep the boom going indefinitely, but Hayek believes Strong's policy was sowing the seeds of an eventual bust.
The way Hayek saw it, the low cost of borrowing was sending the wrong signal to investors here and to businesses around the country. The low interest rate told them that America was saving more, that there was lots of spare cash sitting in bank accounts ready to be lent on and invested. It wasn't true.
Don't sell America short. Why, man, we've scarcely started.
By the time the Federal Reserve spotted the warning signs, it was too late.
Technical readjustment. Over $14 billion go with them, and so goes the confidence of a nation. Wall Street lays in there.
The crash came when interest rates rose and investors started to realize the banks didn't have money to back all those investments after all. At one point, they had to close the visitors' gallery because there were too many members of the public up here wailing and crying as they watched their life savings go up in smoke.
The jazz age is over, all over.
To Hayek, the lesson was clear. By feeding the boom with cheap credit, the Federal Reserve had helped cause the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression.
Hayek thought meddling by government could make it harder for the market to do its job by distorting the signals it was sending to buyers and sellers. And the meddling involved in the government's control of the supply of money, Hayek decided, could be most damaging of all.
So, I really don't want to comment on the level of stock prices. They may have been boosted by expectations about tax policy, possible cuts in corporate tax rates that have been much discussed, or by expectations about growth, possible reductions in downside risk to the economy. But these are things that market participants are trying to view along with the likely paths of interest rates, and I think all of that factors into movements in stock valuations. But I don't want to offer a view as to whether they're appropriate. And
you have mentioned in the on equity.
A great deal this year, and we have in recent months characterized the general level of asset valuations as elevated. What that reflects is simply the assessment that looking at price-earnings ratios and comparable metrics for other assets other than equities, we see ratios that are at the high end of historical ranges, and so that's worth pointing out. But economists are not great at knowing what appropriate valuations are. We don't have a terrific record, and the fact that those valuations are high doesn't mean that they are necessarily overvalued. We are in a somewhat further, supporting faster growth in wages and incomes. Although asset valuations are high by historical standards, overall vulnerabilities in the financial sector appear moderate, as the banking system is well capitalized and broad measures of leverage and credit growth remain contained. Even with the step up in growth
this week, but overall we have seen a remarkable rise in the markets since the recovery started,
Yes.
9 years ago. Former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan said the other day, he said he's seeing a bubble in the stock market and he's seeing a bubble in the bond market. Are you worried about bubbles?
So I don't want to label what we're seeing as a bubble. But I would say that asset valuations generally are elevated, and this is a characterization that we've offered up, for example, last summer in our monetary policy report. For the stock market, the ratio of price to earnings, which is a measure of valuation, is near the high end of its historical range. And if we look at, for example, commercial real estate and other assets, we're seeing high valuations.
So should ordinary Americans be worried about the markets?
They should be careful and, I would say, diversified in their investments. I think what we look at is the likely resilience of the economy and the financial system if there were to be a correction in market valuations. And in that regard, we have a banking system that is much stronger and better capitalized and better able to withstand a shock than prior to the financial crisis. So asset valuations could change. I'm certainly not predicting that that would happen, but we couldn't rule that out. But I think the financial system would be resilient enough to absorb a shock.
I got this rat, this gnawing, key-eating fucking rat. And it brings up questions.
It says, to the socialists of all parties.
As socialism creeps in the economy slowly over time, a lot of people don't notice it. And eventually, you know, you're not on the road to serfdom. You've arrived at serfdom.
The British freed themselves from suffocating feudal regulation centuries before the Europeans. While serfdom still existed in large parts of Europe, the free British were carrying out the great commercial and industrial revolutions that gave birth to the modern world. In the 19th century, unregulated Britain was the pioneer of global free trade, workshop of the world, dominating the world economy like a leviathan. Even on the eve of the First World War, Britain was building around 60% of the world's commercial ships and owned almost half the world's cargo-carrying ocean-going steamers. But the First World War changed everything. New ministries were set up as the government extended its control over every aspect of British life. Industry became heavily regulated. First shipping, then the collieries, railways, canals, and agriculture.
The Great War is, in this as in many other respects, a great watershed in British history. During the war, there's incredibly detailed state control of a whole range of industries. By the end of the war, there's a feeling that there needs to be much more permanent regulation and control of society by the state.
Well, I got to tell you, we need tough regulations. We need regulators who are willing to stand up to the biggest financial institutions in this country. And I want to say with this budget resolution, we're watching. We're watching. Democrats in the Senate are watching. Democrats in the House are watching. And the American people are watching. We will not stand by while the Republicans gut financial regulation in this country.
A company was no longer private property. It was a national asset to be directed from above.
The government increasingly thought that it should plan, it should control, it should regulate.
With World War II, regulation increased still further. War planning gave politicians and administrators unprecedented control over our lives. And after the war, they were unwilling to hand back their power.
I believe that their conclusion that an individual's right to bear arms is a constitutional right.
If it is a constitutional right, then it, like every other constitutional right, is subject to reasonable regulations.
We won the war, so we think that governments must be pretty good, and as a result, everything is then planned.
How we build houses, what houses should look like, how they should be decorated, who should live in them. Virtually every area of life, we had boards of experts working out the best way to do things.
A young couple has dropped in for advice on setting up home. First, they're shown how to avoid overcrowding a room. Always allow at least 18 inches between chairs and other furniture.
Everything from heavy industry down to clothes, food and children's toys were regulated.
If you didn't manage a doll at Christmas, this is probably why. All restrictions on toy making have been lifted, but export has the first claim.
Britain became perhaps the most state-controlled and regulated economy in Europe. The regulation of business, trade, commerce of all kinds was much, much greater than anywhere else.
Regulations, price fixing, protectionism, supporting failed industries.
A heavily regulated economy, ordered from above, the politicians assured us, would be a screaming success.
In a few moments, I will sign the North American Free Trade Act into law. NAFTA will tear down trade barriers between our three nations. It will create the world's largest trade zone and create 200,000 jobs in this country by 1995 alone. The environmental and labor side agreements negotiated by our administration will make this agreement a force for social progress as well as economic growth. Already the confidence we've displayed by ratifying NAFTA has begun to bear fruit. We're now making real progress toward a worldwide trade agreement so significant that it could make the material gains of NAFTA for our country look small by comparison. Today we have the chance to do what our parents did before us. We have the opportunity to remake the world. For this new era, our national security, we now know, will be determined as much by our ability to pull down foreign trade barriers as by our ability to breach distant ramparts.
But the very opposite happened. The purpose of regulation was to end wasteful competition, but it was competition that had kept industry efficient and innovative. Nimble entrepreneurs who were rewarded for success and punished for failure were now replaced by plodding bureaucrats ticking boxes. Productivity and output plummeted. Shortages pushed up prices.
The buying power of the average wage, £5 to £6, has shrunk at an alarming rate. But first among offenders in increasing prices was the government itself. Coal rose, affecting other industries. Electricity charges went up.
Then as we get more money, everything goes up, doesn't it? It must be this inflation they're all talking about.
For ordinary British consumers, life was grim. Goods were either unavailable, unaffordable, or heavily rationed.
Remember, it was Bill Clinton who signed NAFTA, one of the worst economic deals ever made by our country or, frankly, any other country. Never, ever again.
Elaine, are you okay? Come on. You okay? Yep, fine. She has a lot to do with it. She has things called roads. It's a big, and bridges, right? Yes. Okay. 1, 2, 3.
You know, I never much cared for Jews, queers, or fucking Eskimos, but that's just the way I was brought up.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's it. I just wanted to put that out there. I thought we were opening up here.
Said this, indeed, the constraint of the zero lower bound of a nominal interest rate, which was believed to be impossible to conquer, has been almost overcome by the wisdom and practices of central banks, including the BOJ. I am convinced that there is no limit to the measures for monetary easing.
Eternity. Because it's a circle.
Yeah, we heard about the circle. Yes, we're familiar with shapes.
Hey.
So we don't know how to predict productivity growth very well, but we do think it links up over time with things like investment in people, but also investment in plant and equipment, R&D, and that kind of thing. So, and unfortunately, what the financial crisis did was it generated very weak demand conditions for a long time, and that created weak investment. And that itself then furthers weak demand. So it's kind of a bad self-reinforcing cycle that we had there for a while. That's why it is so heartening to see business investment moving up last year, and perhaps continuing a strong performance this year is our expectation. It is ultimately only productivity that raises living standards, and investment is one of the keys. Not just investment in plant and equipment, but certainly in the skills and aptitudes of our people as well.
Do you get a sense that what we've done with
But at the same time, we don't see wages signaling any tightness in the labor market. There's no sense of an overheating economy or a particularly tight labor market. So that's what I would say about maximum employment.
I think those are...
In a 2015 speech, you expressed concern that quantitative easing and unconventional monetary accommodation could fuel dangerous risk-taking. Specifically, you said, quote, "The current extended period of very low nominal rates calls for a high degree of vigilance," unquote. Can you elaborate, and what specific risks have been created that the Fed now has to watch?
Well, I do think this is a time when we need to be alert to buildup of either financial imbalances or to inflation building up. We don't really see those right now. I think I also said that in my 2015 speech. But if you look at the financial stability situation broadly, we do see some high asset prices. What we don't see is the buildup of leverage among households. We see the banking system and the financial system generally as being, very resilient. So I think the financial stability picture shows at most modest risks. If you look at the financial stability situation broadly, we do see some high asset prices. What we don't see is the buildup of leverage among households. We see the banking system and the financial system generally as being, very resilient. So I think the financial stability picture shows at most modest risks. If you look at the financial stability situation broadly, we do see some high asset prices. What we don't see is the buildup of leverage among households. We see the banking system and the financial system generally as being, very resilient. So I think the financial stability picture shows at most modest risks.
If I could point out maybe...
Barring binge of historic proportions, the U.S. Treasury on Thursday wrapping up the final leg of this week's whopping $258 billion sale of new government debt. Reuters reporter Kate Duguid.
This is the second largest ever issuance of debt over the course of a 3-day period by the U.S. government. And the reason that they need to raise so much money is because President Donald Trump's tax bill is expected to add $1.5 trillion to the U.S. deficit. And the budget deal that was recently passed by Congress is expected to add about $300 billion.
Well, I do think this is a time when we need to be alert to buildup of either financial imbalances or to inflation building up. We don't really see those right now. I think I also said that in my 2015 speech.
Tell him about it, Dick.
He's talking about karaoke, you fucking queers!
God damn, Dick knows what I'm talking about.
I think the system is much safer and much sounder. And as I mentioned, we're doing a lot more to try to look for financial stability risks that may not be immediately apparent, but to look in corners of the financial system that are not subject to regulation outside those areas in order to try to detect threats to financial stability that may be emerging. So would I say there will never, ever be another financial crisis? Probably that would be going too far, but I do think we're much safer, and I hope that it will not be in our lifetimes, and I don't believe it will be.
It's our job to guarantee that whatever happens to the federal deficit and debt, that it does not translate into inflation.
The Federal Reserve had been set up in 1913 to stabilize America's notoriously shaky private banks by offering them a reliable source of credit.
Somehow we need to go to an economy that is using its resources, operating at full employment, but doing so in a way that isn't reliant on bubbles anyplace, that is a solid, responsible use of resources.
That means you need to have interest rates that don't discourage savings.
Less subsidies for housing and debt and domestic consumption. Prices closer to what they more naturally should be. So you can get the growth going again in a healthier way, then the burden of the debt gradually gets less and less and less. But of course, the transition is bound to be painful. And then the question becomes, how much short-term pain for how much long-term gain?